Good afternoon and welcome to Equity in Public Schools, Supporting Our Communities Through School Design. I'm Lauren Myatt, co-chair of the AIA Baltimore chapter of the Committee on Architecture for Education. And we're really excited for today's event, for the program, for the presentation, and for the discussion that we have lined up. Because we can't see you all, we can't see your faces, and we're in a virtual world, we encourage everyone to take a moment now, everyone that's joining us, to say hello, introduce yourself, let us know where you're from through the chat box by leaving a message for everyone. On the next slide, you'll see that today's event is co-hosted by and is the result of a joint coalition of 3 local chapters of the AIA Committee on Architecture for Education. This is AIA Baltimore, DC, and Northern Virginia, which we think is a first for our chapters. Through this coalition, we hope to broaden our dialogue on themes pertinent to the design of school facilities and great educational environments, and expand our reach and our resources. This program today represents our common interest to explore equity in educational systems at our local level and to better understand diversity and inclusion obstacles faced by school system leaders, educators, students, and their surrounding communities. Today's event will focus on considerations and strategies to overcome inequity in our schools and support communities through engagement and through school design. On the next slide, you'll see we're joined today by a really exciting, inspiring group of leaders from 3 local public school systems. They'll each be sharing with us innovative ways that they're tackling inequity and resource disparity in their schools with unique strategies for planning, design, and procurement of school facilities and their approaches to community engagement. Our speakers include Dr. Gregory Hutchings, Jr., the Superintendent of Alexandria City Public Schools. On the next slide, also with us is Cyndi Smith, Director of Facilities Design and Construction of Baltimore City Public Schools. From Alexandria City Public Schools, we have Dr. Alicia Hart, the Executive Director of Facilities and Operations, as well as Erica Gulick, Director of Capital Programs, Planning and Design. And from Prince George's County Public Schools, we have Jason Washington, Director of the Public-Private Partnerships Program. So before we get to our speakers, though, we wanted to take a moment to ask everyone to participate in a quick poll that you see on your screen now. You should also see a window pop up momentarily. This is an opportunity before we get into our content for today for everyone to think, express their thought on the greatest challenge that they see to equity in schools. We do expect that we will issue a post-event survey that'll include the same question and see how or if our attendees are impacted by any of today's program content and what we hear today. So now, again, you should see a window that has popped up on your screen. And I would ask everybody to please take a minute to respond. We'll give everybody just about 1 minute, and then we will move on to our wonderful speakers. Okay, so hopefully everybody's had their chance to participate. And we can go on to our next slide where we will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gregory Hutchings, Superintendent of Alexandria City Public Schools. Dr. Hutchings came up through the ranks of Alexandria City Public Schools, graduating from T.C. Williams High School in 1995. He began his teaching career in Virginia, then on to Nashville, Tennessee, where he was promoted from an assistant high school principal to middle school principal. There, he was named Tennessee Middle School Principal of the Year for his role in increasing student achievement and becoming the #1 middle school in metropolitan Nashville based on value added. In 2013, he became superintendent of Shaker Heights Schools, located in a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. Under his leadership, he collaborated with community stakeholders, administrators, and teachers to close the achievement gap and ensure that students of all backgrounds had access to the resources and opportunities needed to succeed. He became one of only 8 superintendents in North America to lead a district offering the International Baccalaureate program for all students at all grade levels. He served 5 years as a superintendent before returning to ACPS as superintendent in July of 2018. In that same year, he was selected for the National Superintendent of the Year Award by the National Alliance of Black School Educators. We're so very excited to have Dr. Hutchings with us today. And with that, Dr. Hutchings, I turn this over to you.
And thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you all, for this opportunity to be able to speak to all of you. I think it is so important for us to always start with where school divisions stand in regards to equity before we even get to the facilities component. So I just love the fact that I'm able to lead this discussion today in talking about who we are in Alexandria City Public Schools and the work that we're doing to dismantle systemic racism in our school division. So I want to talk a little bit about who we are next. And specifically, I want to be able to share with you the demographics of Alexandria City Public Schools. So specifically, I want to kind of start with letting everybody know, because sometimes there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding around who we are as a school division. And Lauren, if you can go to the next slide, that would be helpful. Because a lot of people assume that our school division is predominantly white and rich because the city of Alexandria is predominantly white and one of the richest communities in the country. Our school division actually is predominantly Black and Hispanic. We have 61% of our students who are eligible for free and reduced lunch meals, and we have about 32% of our students who are English learners. So a lot of people are just they misunderstand the students that we serve in our community. And it's so important for us to highlight this because this is one of the greatest assets that we have in Alexandria City Public Schools, the amount of diversity that we have, students from 119 different countries who are part of our school system, and over 120 different languages that are spoken in the homes of our students. So we are really a very diverse institution that is going to change the world, and we're going to be able to change the world through equity. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about this dual pandemic. And I know that you all right now are extremely exhausted by our global pandemic that everybody across the entire world is currently experiencing with COVID-19. Well, we're calling this a dual pandemic in Alexandria City Public Schools. Specifically, what we are discussing and talking about and working towards is the fact that we have this global pandemic that we're all working through. And then we also have a racial pandemic that has been happening for over 400 years. This is not something that's new. It's very prevalent in the news today, and a lot of people are talking about this, especially through the Black Lives Matter movement. However, we have been dealing with a racial pandemic since, Africans arrived right here in Alexandria, Virginia, for over 400 years ago. So what are we doing about this dual pandemic in Alexandria City Public Schools? And that's what I want to talk with you all about to kind of set the stage for our discussion later on today. Next slide. You've got to have courage and you have to be bold. And this is something that we stand for in Alexandria City Public Schools. I have to, say hats off to our school board who unanimously voted to approve our strategic plan in June of 2020. We're now about a year into almost finishing our first year in our strategic plan, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. But you got to have the courage, and you got to have the boldness in your leadership in order to change culture within any organization. And one thing that we are just so adamant about is being unapologetic about dismantling systemic racism, because it is prevalent not only in Alexandria City Public Schools, but across the country. And with that courage and with that boldness, if you are doing this unapologetically and you're doing this for the right reasons, and you have an all hands on deck approach, you will be able to attain the goals that you set within your organization. Next slide. So let's talk about our strategic plan. You know, one thing that we're doing in Alexandria City Public Schools as we dismantle racial inequities and establish a culture of anti-racism, we have adopted our Equity for All 2025. This is a 5-year strategic plan that went through a huge process in order to develop the plan that really serves as our roadmap to our success. And specifically, what we were able to do is we identified all different stakeholder groups to be a part of our strategic planning process. And we're talking about families who have been unheard for many years were at the table, because we wanted to ensure that everybody had a seat at the table. You know, when you begin to talk about things like race, it causes a lot of anxiety for many, and a lot of people try to avoid the topic because it makes people uncomfortable. And what we're saying in Alexandria City Public Schools is that no one has the right to be comfortable. We have to lean into our discomfort for the next generation and for many generations to come. Next slide. So our strategic plan, and why a strategic plan. And if you don't have one, regardless of what organization you are a part of, then you are pretty much going down a path into nowhere, because you're not really sure what your path is and what you're striving to do within the organization. You know, your strategic plan mainly is there to assist you with having a shared mission and vision and core values. And that's just not for your staff. It's also for the Board of Education. You want to make sure that you have specific priorities and that you have the systemic alignment within your organization. So all decisions that are being made and all action steps that are happening, that they are related to the goals that you have set within your organization. And then when I talk about that courageousness and the boldness that I know our board and our staff and our leaders have, we are all about using our strategic plan to remove those institutional barriers that have been long-standing in Alexandria City Public Schools for many, many years, really since the beginning of our time. Next slide. So why racial equity? And I love this picture right here, because as I said earlier, we have such a diverse student population and community in the city of Alexandria. And the question really is, why not racial equity? And as I said before, everyone is so uncomfortable when you begin to talk about race. But some of the reasons why we're continuing to see this perpetuation of systemic racism, not only in education, but across our country, is because we're not saying, you know what, this is the time to actually talk about this. This is time for us to lean into our discomfort. This is time for us to be bold, to say no more in Alexandria or within the United States of America. Next slide. So race is the root cause. And we have been working with an organization called GARE. And specifically, we have done some research, and what you'll find is that when you take race and you connect it to anything, whether it's students with disabilities or religious expression or LGBTQ community or academic achievement, anytime you associate race to that, then you begin to see disparities instantly. Race is the root cause to many of our challenges. And it doesn't mean that because you're a certain race that you're going to have certain disabilities, or because you're a certain race, you're going to, have certain issues. What it means is that race is a construct that was created to make people who were non-white inferior. And now that we are in 2021, right, and this construct that was created many, many years ago with Linnaeus, one of the researchers who actually started, he's the father of race in a sense, because he began to categorize different, races and put labels. He actually put labels to them. Linnaeus is who I'm referring to. But today in 2021, as we are using this racial construct to determine what people can and can't do, there are some biases that come along with that impact what is happening within our school buildings and what's happening across America. And that's when people begin to make assumptions as because of the color of your skin that you're capable or able to do X, Y, or Z. Well, this is what this racial construct has created in our country. And if we don't identify it and talk about it and hit it head on, it will continue to perpetuate throughout our time. Next slide. So racial equity for Alexandria City Public Schools is when race does not determine your quality of life, it doesn't determine your opportunities, and it definitely does not determine your outcomes. And our goal, as I said earlier, is we have to remove barriers for our students and for our staff within our organization so that they can attain whatever successful goals they have set for themselves. You know, so when we make racial equity the heart of every single thing that we do, and that is from our strategic plan to our facilities, to how we fund our schools and how we fund different departments within our organization, or where we assign staff members to go. It all relates to racial equity being the heart of our work. And our team is going to talk a little bit more specifically about what that looks like, especially in regards to our facilities and our operations. Next slide. In order to do all of these things, it's so important that you establish some clear principles. And I think that, you know, a lot of times people say, okay, well, let's just go tackle race, right? Let's just go get this work done. If you don't have clear principles that have been established that you're following and using as your guide, as you're embarking on whether it's a strategic plan or tackling this inequities or dismantling systemic racism, you will find yourself not achieving the goals that you have set. So specifically what we've done in Alexandria is we've made sure that we're being data informed. We're using our data to acknowledge our deficit areas as well as to acknowledge the celebrations that we have within our organization. We conducted our needs assessment. We've done a data workbook, which is for our strategic plan. We also do an analysis every year of our efforts and our work. You got to make sure that you have voices at the table. And this is so key because every voice, sometimes, you know, the loudest voices in your community make things happen. Well, you got to hear the loudest voice, but you also have to go hear the unheard voices and go seek to understand where people who may not have typically had a seat at the table, where they stand, so that you can ensure that you're getting a collective voice. Equity has to be your focus, not equality. Equality means equal. Equity is meeting people where they are, right? And not necessarily where you want them to be. And that looks different for whoever you're working with. So equity focus. That systemic alignment is key because if you don't have those systems and that alignment in place, you will set yourself up for failure. And then prioritization. Everyone wants to do everything when you have a strategic plan. And it is so important that you prioritize, that you make sure that when you are on this journey to being an anti-racist school system like Alexandria City Public Schools, that you are identifying what your key performance indicators are and ensuring that you have metrics that will measure whether you have attained these key performance indicators or if you're making the progress that you seek or that you deem necessary. Next slide. So I'm going to stop here. I just want to first thank our team for the work that they continue to do, to be courageous, to be bold. I want to thank you all for giving us the opportunity to talk about Alexandria City Public Schools. And I'm also going to challenge each and every one of you to be bold, to be courageous, to be unapologetic. Because if we don't do this collectively with an all hands on deck approach, we will fail the next generation and many generations to come. Thank you all for this time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hutchings. It's so inspiring to see under your leadership, everything that Alexandria City Public Schools is looking to accomplish. And we really appreciate you joining us today. So we'll move on to our next speaker. We have Cyndi Smith with us from Baltimore City Public Schools. Cyndi is the Director of Facilities Design and Construction. Prior to this, she was the Senior Educational Facilities Planner for City Schools. In her director role, she oversees the design and construction of all of the City Schools capital projects across the portfolio of 156 buildings, which is approximately 20 to 30 projects and about 35 to 45 million per year of work. In addition, she's involved in the 21st Century Schools Initiative, which City Schools is currently undertaking. Cyndi is active in the Association for Learning Environments, or A4LE, serving on the Northeast Region Board, as well as the Chesapeake Bay Delaware Valley Chapter Board. She has been recognized as a fellow in the Structural Engineering Institute, as well as the American Society of Civil Engineers for her contributions. Cyndi, we're excited to have you today. And with that, I will go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I think Dr. Hutchings is going to be a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best here. So thank you for having me. So as I started to look at this topic, there were so many ways that equity plays into facilities design. So I decided to try to do some higher level overviews on a few and then go deeper into a couple aspects. Next slide. And one more. So just I want to start with who Baltimore City Schools is. We currently have a population of about 78,000 students, just a little less than 78,000 students. The majority of those are in elementary school. And of course, we go pre-K to 12. We currently have 165 programs and schools in 156 buildings. We do have multiple co-located school programs. That breaks down into elementaries, but we also have a combination of elementary middles, middle highs, and then a variety of other kind of like special ed programs and things like that in standalone buildings. So our demographics and why it becomes important then for us is, of course, we are about 78% African American, about 7.5% white, with the remainder being Hispanic and Latino and other nationalities. We are about 58% low income and just about 10% English language learner, as well as about 15% with students with disabilities. So we do have a very diverse profile. We are a choice district, which means that once you get to 6th grade, students can choose which schools they are going to, whether it's the middle school within their quadrant or the high school within any school in the district. We do have several schools that have enrollment qualifications, and then several that are just open as well for high school level. We are a declining populations district, unfortunately. We have been losing enrollment over many years, not just due to the recent pandemic, but we've been declining for much longer than that, unfortunately. But we do have pockets where we have significant utilized schools where enrollment has grown, but then other pockets where we are significantly underutilized, where we've decreased even more in those areas. Next slide. So most of our buildings were built between 1895 and 1995. We do have the oldest buildings in the state. We have approximately 17 million square feet of space currently. We are the 4th largest district in Maryland and the 40th in the US. And we do have a district-wide utilization percentage of 86% currently. However, that means we've closed a lot of buildings recently to get to that stage. And our current annual operating budget is about $1.4 billion. Let's get that right. That's with a B. We do have buildings going back as far as the 1880s, just one. That 1895 was the addition to that. And we do have a few more buildings now that have been built recently through the 21st Century Program, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Next slide. So back in 2013, we underwent an initiative where we partnered with the communities, the state, and the city to win support for the 21st Century Buildings Program. That's what we're calling it. So in 2013, the funding and the oversight structures were implemented to perform that plan to do that, with the first phase of construction being about $1 billion. There was a House Bill 860 in 2013, which charged the Maryland Stadium Authority, MSA, for overseeing the financing of the plan, as well as establishing that partnership with the city schools, the state, and MSA. So it's a 4-party partnership. Advocacy groups worked for 10 years prior to that to get this money to help with our schools and to improve our schools. So this has been a long time coming. However, the bill also required included the requirement to surplus 26 buildings, and we're actually going to be surplusing more than that because of that underutilized percentage and where we were with the utilization across the district. To try to get to that 86% utilization, we had to surplus buildings, which means closing schools, which is a huge community effort and a community lift. And to accomplish all of this, we did set out to create some standard ed specs to center the designs on what we needed to build. Next, please. So we developed a cross-functional process to create the ed specs for the district. The whole point was to embrace 21st century paradigms. We had a partner, an architect, who helped lead several workshops. This is just one photo of one of the many workshops that included representatives from every department within the district. And then we took it out to communities, and we had community input as well to create the district-wide ed specs, which have then become the foundation for everything we've built since then. Next, please. During that workshop, we looked at what kind of educational delivery we were looking for, what kind of implication that would have for facilities. We of course fought the battles of what has to happen in a school and what shouldn't happen in a school. There were battles about organization structure and disagreements and several conversations about how the school should be organized. Whether or not teachers should own classrooms and whether we should have the collaborative areas. We did talk about the kinds of spaces that were desired and how children learned, of course, to create this facility, to create a facility that would meet 21st century education. And we did come up with things like collaborative spaces and things like that that have been a challenge since then with the state, as we were the first one within the state to really implement that. Next, please. So we developed these core concepts that were the overriding concepts of the entire process. One, educational clustering for small learning environments, transformational thinking. The one I'm going to focus on here in a minute is community use spaces and joint use of spaces and resources, because that's where I'm focusing the discussion on equity on my lens. Of course, the entire thing of improving the portfolio is about equity and bringing equitable environments to our students. But building light, bright, healthy learning environments, sustainable concepts, which were not necessarily something that we had necessarily focused on before, as well as technology integration. So I'm going to focus on the community use spaces here because we wanted to go deeper into how the school supports the whole child as the community and how school design should be tailored to serve the specific needs of the community for the students. Next, please. So just a little bit, flexible adaptive spaces, interactive social areas, engaging spaces. These were just the key words that we try to remember as we're going through everything. But the multifunctional spaces for community and parent use, as well as for student use, is really the key that I'm going to talk about. This is an example. For example, this photo is of a multi-purpose room, a cafeteria and auditorium that is in the core of a building that can serve then for both community use as well as, of course, for student use during the days. And of course, we did all of this without increasing the square foot per student average because we were pushed by the state to not increase the sizes of the buildings. We borrowed spaces from other uses and had to eliminate some uses or decrease some sizes of spaces so that we could still keep within that square foot. Next slide, please. Just real quick, student wholeness goals was our focus with 21st century education, sustainability, and the school being the anchor for the community. Next slide, please. So the biggest thing, one of the biggest things that we did that really promotes the equity side of things and where we want to do is we wanted to create spaces for the community, not just for the students, but for everybody that uses a school, especially in an urban environment. You have a lot of people that use the building at all times. So that actually focuses on what the students need. So we had up to 3,000 square foot of space that was approved by the state. And several of those, that space included several of these uses. So we created a personal care space, for example, in each school. So that includes a shower. It's a restroom with a shower. So we have a high population of homeless students, for example. So if you have a student who's been homeless, they aren't necessarily having access to, personal care facilities to really take care of themselves. So we have this space where if a student really needs to, come in and take care of themselves, they have that space. In addition, it also supports, again, the whole child population, in that if there is a student who has issues with accidents in the special education programs or anything like that, there's a space that they can take care of things. There's a laundry room. So again, for homeless in particular, or you have a lot of students who just can't, don't have the resources to be able to clean their uniforms, because we do mostly have uniforms across our district. Their volunteers can come in and do the laundry in the laundry room for those students. All of the schools have food pantries. So we have food pantries as anchors within the community now in all of those schools. There's a resource room for the parents to be able to come in and support the students and support the school and volunteer their time and work with the school. There's dedicated out of school time support space for all of the after care and before care that's needed for our students, because otherwise they're going home to empty homes, most likely. We have dedicated space that supports that. We have partner spaces. A lot of our schools are supported by partners that provide the food pantry, that provide the out of school time support needs. So there's spaces that they can then run those programs out of. And as well as there's a large common space. So we have a lot of GED programs that operate out of our buildings, for example. And then any other community needs, whether that's the PTA meeting that needs to happen, or whether it's an English class that needs to happen for parents. Parents and community support staff can use the common space without renting it, because that's all part of the way we do it. There's no rental fee for it. And they can have classes, and these are separate from the learning spaces in the building. So they can actually have the classes during the daytime hours even, and not be interfering with the learning spaces within the building. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we're building wholeness and mindfulness rooms in all of our buildings for the students that need, just a break. Some of us, sometimes, even as adults, we need a break and get away. Of course, there's the guidance suite and psychologists and social workers, but we have mental health coordinators going into every school as well as a heavy number of ESOL in most of our buildings, speech, IEP, and occupational physical therapists. Now, all of these spaces now have dedicated spaces within the school to be able to provide their services so that we can support the whole child, and devoting the space to the specific needs of those children, and not just, the OT crammed in whatever storage closet that there was. And, no space for a wholeness room that now is a really important initiative of the district. And the wholeness and mindfulness rooms is really actually right within our strategic plan in the district. So now we've actually brought some of these focuses that we've been putting in the buildings now actually to within the whole. So it's a whole well-rounded and circular process. Other things that I didn't even mention are the gender neutral and single stall bathrooms and rest locker rooms within the buildings, as well as lactation rooms in the schools, not just for staff, but for students, because that gets the students that have children back to school rather than just dropping out and not coming back. So, providing the services that they need to be able to keep their students in school. Next slide. And this is just a quick one. This is an example of one of the floor plans and how we do this, so that you can have the community space and all those community uses and still keep the learning activities going on, and then have the core spaces like the cafeteria, which can be used for larger groupings or whatever, that is then central to the core as well, so that all of these uses can support the entire community at any given time. Next, please. And that's all I have. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Cyndi. It's so interesting to see the workshop process and your approach to community engagement, and then how that really manifests into your school facilities. So thank you for that. So next up, we have Dr. Alicia Hart from Alexandria City Public Schools. Dr. Hart has been with ACPS since December of 2019. She joined the organization in the role of Director of Educational Facilities where she was responsible for the management and execution of non-capacity capital improvement projects. In December of 2020, she was promoted to the Executive Director of Facilities and Operations. In this role, she oversees multiple support operations for the division, including transportation, school nutrition, safety and security, maintenance and custodial services, and capital projects. Prior to joining ACPS, she was the Assistant Director of Public Works, Maintenance and Operations with Prince William County. And before her time there, she held the capacity of Administrative Budget Manager for Maryland National Capital Parks and Planning Commission, where she developed, managed, and administered an annual operating budget of $250 million for the Department of Parks and Rec. Dr. Hart, we're pleased to have you with us, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I am really excited to be able to share how ACPS and how the Facilities and Operations Department within ACPS is imparting equity into our new construction and design process. Next slide, please. So on the screen, what's shared is our essential questions that I hope to answer through today's presentation, to include: what is ACPS's stance on equity? How is our Facilities and Operations Department making sure that we are bringing equity within the fold? How will equity be included in our new school designs? And also, what are the next steps that we will be taking in this endeavor? If we can move on to the next slide, please. To begin, I'd like to reiterate what Dr. Hutchings stated earlier in just saying that any type of equity effort must be supported from the top down. ACPS is very lucky to have a school board and also a superintendent that is deeply committed to equity within our division. Dr. Hutchings shared a number of the tenets that are included in our Equity for All Strategic 2025 plan that was adopted by our school board in June 2020. And again, I do want to reiterate that our overall pledge as a division is to make sure that we are providing equitable, high quality education that is accessible and engaging to all of our students. Next slide, please. So how do we begin to really address equity within our facilities and operations process, more so specifically when it comes to the design of our new facilities and just construction in general? To begin, what our team has been doing has really been assessing what is our current process and how are we currently moving through the steps of CIP planning and development. So right now, what we are doing is completing facilities condition assessments, whether those are targeted or comprehensive, to determine the condition of our facilities, to prioritize our projects, and then to also discuss what funding is needed to complete those projects. There are times that we are in the midst of those projects that we begin to hear from some of our most vocal communities as to why their schools projects should be reprioritized. And quite honestly, some of those communities are the more affluent communities and are not always representative of our racial demographic within the school division. When we do move through the effort of reprioritizing projects because of hearing from these vocal communities, what tends to happen is that we are failing those other communities that we have not heard from or that have not had an opportunity to provide their feedback in this process. And we notice that this is really becoming more and more of an inequity in how we are making sure that we are addressing the needs of all of our stakeholders. And again, what's shared on the slide is that this process just does not always consider the needs of everyone within our community. Next slide, please. And so to that end, my team and I have really been focused on making a change, a concerted effort. And what does that include? It includes making sure that we are identifying areas in which we are falling short and acknowledging that. It includes us establishing updated procedures and processes to address these inequities in our capital development or other operational areas. And then also making sure that we are measuring outcomes to make sure that any changes that we are imparting or including in our processes are actually impactful. Next slide, please. So one of the areas that we did notice we were falling short is in our communication strategy. And essentially what we've noticed is that throughout our design process, our minority and underrepresented communities are not as involved as we would like for them to be. And it is important for us to make sure that we are hearing feedback from all of those within our community. So to this end, we have started a very highly focused effort to make sure that we are reaching these key demographics and key stakeholders so we can get their feedback through the design process. And there are a few ways in which we are really making changes to address these groups. The first is to make sure that we have interpreter services through all of our community meetings. As I'm sure most of you all have had to do over this past year, our community engagement process has been basically 100% virtual, but Zoom has been a wonderful way to make sure that we are still reaching those communities, and it does have that interpretation feature. And this is really important for us because within ACPS, we have four distinct languages that are widely spoken, to include English, Spanish, Amharic, and Arabic. So having those interpreter services, again, have been instrumental in making sure that not only we can reach our community members, but we can also answer the questions that they may have through our Zoom meetings or our webinar formats that we host. Additionally, we are making sure that we are meeting specifically with our underrepresented groups to get their feedback. Lastly, we are working very closely with our communications department to develop communication strategies to reach all of our groups. ACPS is very lucky to have a FACE office, and FACE stands for Family and Community Engagement. And through this office and through our communications department, we are making sure that we are doing outreach that is not just email blasts to notify the community of upcoming meetings, but that we are also doing text outreach. We are also making phone calls, because one thing that we did realize is that emails are not always the most efficient or the most effective way to reach our key stakeholder groups. Next slide, please. And so how are we making changes within our actual design process? One of the things that is key to us, and I know that we'll get into this a little bit later as well through the panel, I'm sure, is that ACPS is no longer embracing the practice of naming our schools after any historical figure that either promoted or supported racist ideology. This is really big for ACPS, and we recently just went through a renaming process for 2 of our schools. We are also focused on making sure that we have individualized non-gender bathrooms in our new construction design to make sure that we are respecting gender identity for our students. We are making sure that we are also involving students within the design process, which has been really impactful, specifically on one of our projects that I'll get to a little bit later. And we're also making sure that we are providing various learning spaces to accommodate our most diverse learners. Next slide, please. And so one of the examples that I'll highlight today is our new Douglas MacArthur Elementary School. We are excited that construction is underway for this particular school. It's been long overdue. And through this design, we are, again, using the approach of our individualized restrooms to be respectful of gender identity. And that does include making sure that we are not including urinals, because again, we want to make sure that our restrooms are gender neutral. Next slide, please. Another design example that I'd like to share today is the high school project. So our team is currently involved in the multi-year engagement process, concept development design process for the new arm of our high school. We are really excited about this because this multi-year process allows us an opportunity to make sure that we have the time to properly engage all of our stakeholders. The one thing that the team has made sure that they are focused on is acknowledging diversity as a strength from the onset of their concept development for this particular school, which is really important. Something else that we feel is unique to ACPS is we have created a multi-campus design for this particular high school that we do believe will help provide equitable opportunities for our students. And lastly, our students were engaged in a very involved renaming process for this particular location. Some of you all may be aware that our high school was formerly named T.C. Williams High School. It is now named Alexandria City High School. And we're very, very happy and very excited about that name change. Next slide, please. So to conclude, I just want to share that, again, equity within schools really has to be endorsed from the top down, not just endorsed, but supported from the top down in order for it to prove successful. It is important to make sure that you are expanding your outreach efforts to your minority and underrepresented communities to make sure that that input is being heard for new school design, specifically because their students will also be attending the schools that you are constructing. And then lastly, making sure that while the equity work we are doing in this arena is not as visible as maybe some other areas, just acknowledging the fact that it is still relevant and it is still very impactful. Lastly, I really just want to close with the fact that our students, regardless of their race, their socioeconomic status, their gender identity, deserve facilities that are designed to address their educational, their emotional, and their social needs. And so I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to present today. And I'll be turning it back over to Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hart, for all that great information. It's so great to hear about the ways that ACPS is expanding outreach efforts, and again how that's manifesting into the design of your school facilities. So lastly, we have from Prince George's County Public Schools, Jason Washington, the director of the Public-Private Partnerships Program. Since beginning his career as a teacher, Jason has always sought out opportunities that have a direct impact on the lives of others. From practicing law to working in community development, and in his current position, leading the development and implementation of the nation's first K-12 bundled schools concessionaire model, he sought positions that allow him to serve and create dynamic programs. Prior to leading this effort, he was the executive director of the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships, the vice president of business and economic development of Provias, and led the Metropolitan Washington Community Wealth Building Initiative at City First Enterprises as senior vice president. Jason has also served as a White House Fellow assigned to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Previously, he was a senior policy advisor to the mayor of Baltimore and served as chair of the mayor's school construction task force. Prior to joining city government, Jason also practiced law as a corporate associate. That is quite a bit of a bio. Jason, with that, I'll turn the floor over to you.
That's a more generous description than my parents give it. It's more like I don't know what I want to do with my life. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. It is my pleasure to be here to tell you how we at Prince George's County Public Schools are addressing inequity through a bundled schools public-private partnership approach that we're using to address our asset deficiencies. Next slide. So a little bit about Prince George's County. We are top 20 by enrollment sized school district, majority African-American and Hispanic population, with over 67% of our students that qualify for free and reduced lunch, even though we are also one of the most affluent majority minority jurisdictions in the country. And so over probably beginning early 80s through really the turn of the century, to push back against the growing enrollment numbers of African Americans specifically, decisions were made to not build schools and to not invest in the schools that had been built around the county, leading to some significant issues that we've come up against and that led us to the P3 approach. In early 2017, we did an educational facilities master plan, which identified basically that we have an $8.3 billion assets deficiency need. And that is to modernize our stock of roughly 206 school buildings, and with an annual capital budget of roughly $160 million per year. It will take a couple of generations to get there using the usual approach which is state funded. Which is soup to nuts, is roughly about 7 years to determine and to build and deliver a new school, one new school. Our approach now, looking through the model of a public-private partnership, is to deliver 6 middle schools in 2 years. So by the summer of 2023, we will provide 8,000 new seats across 6 campuses across and spanning all of the county. We chose middle schools because that's where the booming enrollment is. And so, really how we are looking at equity and how we are addressing inequity within the system is delivering high quality schools as quickly as we can to as many communities that have been impacted by underinvestment for quite some time, and utilizing our schools as the fundamental community anchor, so to speak, for the communities. This presentation goes through how we went about putting together this program and the pieces of it, to show how we were trying to include as many voices as possible, while also ensuring that we were a community benefit, that this program just did not take, but also gave. Next slide, please. And so what we started was a 2.5-year procurement process that really set forth our objectives of delivering high quality schools as quickly as possible and as many as possible. That we wanted to make sure that we had every type of voice at the table. So we set up subcommittees, which I'm sure many of you have heard about in terms of public procurement and how the selection process works. But we really wanted to make sure that, we had folks from the design and construction, that we had folks from the maintenance side of things, that we had members from the financial advisory committee involved to allow us to understand the impacts that these schools will have as we move forward to getting them in place. And then we moved to a 9-member selection committee, where it was a joint effort between the school system, the county council, and a tri-level effort rather, the school system, the county council, and the administration, to ensure that we were taking all viewpoints into account as we made our selection. Next slide. And so some of the components that we laid out into this process was the way that the developer is paid, which is Prince George's County Education and Community Partners, was the selected developer, is through what is known as an availability payment, where we are only going to pay per year, and it's monthly, but we will only pay if the buildings are available as set forth in the contract that we negotiated. There would be a capital charge escalation, which is 1.5%, which is less than what we're seeing now year to year. Escalation for construction, which is roughly around 5 to 6% that we were looking at. But it's also offset by a deduction regime that's put in place to ensure that total compliance of that contract. And our capital investments would be, once the buildings are at 50% completion, or 50% of the design build agreement price has been expended, we would provide a progress payment, and then milestone payments upon occupancy. Those are offset with potential liquidated damages if the buildings are not delivered on time through no fault of ours and there's no relief events. The buildings right now are contracted to be delivered July 15th, 2023. And liquidated damages start totaling on July 16th until delivery of the school. Next slide. So a big piece of really how we wanted to protect our investment and also the communities at large, we had a big fiasco with the Purple Line, where the contractor walked off and stopped work, leaving open roads, unfilled potholes all over the place, and just a litany of construction activity up and down the county that were an eyesore for quite some time for the community. And so we wanted to put in place some measures that allow for the certainty that we would complete this job, and if we didn't, we would protect the county's interest. And so we put in place things like a long stop date. No matter what, these buildings must be done by July 2024 is the long stop date where we will accept any building. We also put in place an independent engineer that will call balls and strikes between us and the developer to ensure compliance with the contract and ensure that we continue to move forward. But once the buildings are delivered, we have moved into a services period, which allow us to run the deductions regime, as I said, and perform monitoring reports, as well as we have step-in rights if they are missing the mark and we need to come in and rectify anything. Next slide. And so, as just mentioned it before, around the 30-year services period, which is really why we did this program, is the asset management on the back end, because that is usually an underfunded part of our budget. And part of this that allows for the buildings to be maintained for 30 years and the developer to be held to 48 KPIs that they have to comply with per month or be subject to deductions. Next slide. And so these are the handback requirements. When we receive the building back 30 years after occupancy, all of these components must have the minimum required useful life, or there will be a penalty on the developer. Next slide. And so we really went about this and ran the numbers, and because of really the deferred maintenance cost, this is why a P3 structure for us made a lot of sense, is because we were able to really eliminate close to $235 million of deferred maintenance costs by immediately beginning the bundled schools program. Next slide. Finally, as we're wrapping up, we really wanted to focus on community investment through, setting up partnerships with employee PGC for workforce development, putting together mentor programs. We were able, through the savings in our negotiations, to create $1 million endowed scholarship contribution to the Fund for Public Equity for Prince George's County Public Schools that will provide scholarships for students. So we have begun that work of community investment. Next slide. And these are some of the economic indicators that we utilized for moving forward with what we were called the ACS at the time, Alternative Construction Finance. And the one final thing around the systems and the services period, every system in the building has to be replaced prior to turnover. So all of the HVAC, mechanical, painting, windows, every system, every inch of the building must undergo a systems refresh before we take ownership of the building. Next slide. And so finally, as we talk about our community investment and the equity that we want to provide to the community and really getting MBE and local business participation, we have a 30% minimum required MBE compliance participation requirement on dollars spent, not on participation. So within the next 2 years, there's a requirement on the developer to procure over $127 million, and over the program, $205 million to local MBEs and small businesses. Next slide. And here are some nice, beautiful pictures of what the schools will look like. And I want to just say that, our next steps, we're going through the permitting process now. We break ground on all 6 sites the first week in July. So this has been we signed the contract in December. We are breaking ground on 3, I believe, of the schools. First week in July, all schools will be under construction by the end of July, some construction activities. And so we are hoping that this provides a potential tool for school systems to look at to really start addressing the asset deficiencies and inequities that exist through facilities across this country. And with that, I will be quiet and turn it over to Lauren to lead us into the next phase of this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. It's so interesting to see the curtain pulled back a bit and how Prince George's County got away from business as usual to find a way to really best serve the community and the student needs there with a unique procurement process. So we're going to move into the next phase of our program. That is going to be our panelists moderated discussion. I'm going to introduce Janine Kotab from AIA Northern Virginia. She is the chair of the CAE chapter there, and Janine is going to lead us through this next portion of the program.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to all of our panelists and to our keynote speaker, Dr. Hutchings. I'm going to invite all the panelists now to join me to turn on your cameras and to turn on your audio. Thank you. So I think we're waiting for Erica. Great. Wonderful. So thank you all so much for those presentations. I think it's very fascinating to see 3 different school districts presenting their approach to equity and the different innovations that you guys are all taking. And really, you're all at different phases as well, right? So it's really interesting to see what the spectrum is from a facilities perspective and how the different approaches all really start to address equity. So to kick us off with a conversation, I want to start with the poll responses that we got from the poll that we started early on. And the question was, what do you feel is the greatest challenge to equity in schools? The top 3 answers that we got from our attendees today, the first was under-resourced, underfunded communities, 61%. So that got the top response. The second was aging and poorly maintained school facilities at 45%. And the third was systemic racism at 38%. So I kind of want to take a step back and think about those responses and also think about where we are in time today. We're about a year from the murder and the death of George Floyd, which really kind of shook our nation and sent us on this direction. We're also about a year and a half into the pandemic, and we've all been working from home. And we've seen how COVID has had such an impact on our communities, and how prior to COVID, any sort of systemic inequities that existed were only exacerbated by this pandemic. So I'd like to kind of go through the virtual room today and ask everyone, what is equity? Can we start to really define it? And it might be different for each institution. And Dr. Hutchings got, he said some great stuff earlier today about that. But I'm going to start maybe with Jason. If you could give me a, statement, what do you think equity is?
I was thinking about this, and I think equity starts with empathy. And I say that because of the fact that I think to have equity, you must first try to view the world in somebody else's eyes. And I think that is what is missing a lot. And when we have the community engagement conversations that we have with building schools, et cetera, it's, what someone else believes is equitable in their eyes is wholly inequitable to someone else. And to me, that is where I believe we have to start. And what I believe is the foundational piece and defining cornerstone of equity is, let's first start with empathy, and let's first start from a shared sense of shared foundation. And then we can start moving towards equity. And because if everybody is starting from different places, equity will be achieved in one, but not in another sense. And so that's how I am looking at it, and really how we try to approach this lens of this, what we're doing in terms of the building and in terms of what we're putting in the buildings is, let's be reflective and understand the communities of which we're building in.
Great, thank you. Erica, you've just joined us. Thank you so much for being here. Maybe you could kind of give the next answer.
So I would certainly agree with what Jason has said, but also when Dr. Hutchings talked about meeting everyone where they are, I think that's really where we start. And from a facility standpoint and design standpoint, when we think about how do we meet our students where they are, and how do we make sure we're designing spaces that is going to lead to good outcomes for them. So I think that's that's how we define it, at least in our world.
Thank you. And Cyndi, maybe if you could be the last one to answer this question.
I'm not sure that I have anything more to add though than what any of the three of previous have had. So I would say that, definitely meeting the students where they are and supporting the families and the students in the community. I wanted to add though that the one thing it is not is equality, because we've heard that one a lot, is that, oh, they are not the same thing. Spending equal amounts of money at schools, saying that students deserve the same no matter where they are, that is not what equity is. That's very different.
Yeah, and maybe the flip side to this question, some of the root issues that lead to inequity. Dr. Hart, could you kind of talk and touch on some of those root issues from your perspective?
Wow. I honestly think that, speaking through the lens of a school division, some of the items that lead to those inequities are not hearing the voices of those that are underrepresented, the unheard communities. And that could really be just due to systematic racism. It can be due to the fact that a lot of minority communities have not been encouraged to be vocal about their needs, because it can be seen as being too aggressive or too forward to really address that. And I think the inability to listen, or the past inability to really just listen, not listen to respond, but actually listening to the communities, our Black, our brown, our underrepresented communities, in terms of what they need, what it is they would like to see in our facilities for their children and for their grandchildren, I think is something that historically divisions all across this nation have not done a good job with. And so I think now that we're looking at things through an equity lens, and really specifically to ACPS with racial equity at the heart of what it is that we're doing, we're pulling back a lot of those covers. We're having those difficult conversations, and we're really making sure that those communities have an opportunity to be heard.
Thank you. And, the listening piece really ties back to what Jason talked about with the empathy. In order to empathize, you need to know where somebody's coming from. So, Jason, I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into your program. So this developer-driven approach to school construction shifts how we start to measure success. We don't traditionally think of ROI when we're designing schools, especially because so often those impacts of a positive education, they are long-term, they can take generations. So what are some of the short-term and long-term measures that you all are using to determine, if you're being successful with this P3 program?
Yeah, I think one of the big pieces that we started out with is each school has what is known as a project planning committee, which is made up of community stakeholders, teachers, and elected officials. And the first real, measurable for us is how are we, and how specifically the developer and the development team, adapting to that feedback, and going from, well, this is what your ed spec says, and this is what your tech spec says, so we design to that, and how they are adapting to, well, actually, our community, we have a community laundry in the school. So, well, you only said that, it was very broad, it was not specific. Well, now we're being specific. So now we want you to adapt, this school, because the big savings here is that it's a prototype school. So to them, it was like, hey, we're going to put it in 4 separate schools. Great, good. What now the PPC allows is for more engagement and the evolving that Cyndi talked about at first, of how they started developing 21st centuries on the front end. We're doing it after we have somebody on board where they're tied financially to making sure that we are happy. And so we have seen that has added, some more innovation and some more adaptation that I can't say would have happened on the front side, because we would not have known, because how our usual process is driven is through us at capital programs, and then we release it to the schools and the school communities after we basically done. So it's been really moving over and holding them accountable to how they are adapting and how they are evolving the design while it's accelerated, but still being, sensitive to the communities of which we're building the schools in.
Okay, great, thank you. So Cyndi, I want to turn it to you a little bit. reflecting on the last year with COVID-19, we've seen that our school infrastructure across the country has really failed our students and our communities. So from your perspective, how did our buildings get to such a point of disrepair, and what do our institutions need in order to be successful moving forward? We know that there will be some new federal funding that's going to be made available to states in order to support school infrastructure. Has your institution started to talk about what that money is going to be allocated towards? And also internally, what are some of the systems and measures that need to change in order to provide a better safety net for the future?
Sure, there's a lot of components to that. So let's see if I can hit them all. So first of all, I think that a lot of it has to do with, in my opinion, a long-standing record of underfunding education, and particularly for underprivileged communities. When funding is coming from all one place and it's needed for academics, and you're trying to do academics funding as well as facility funding from the same amount, it's going to mostly go to academics, and then the preventive maintenance is going to be reduced and eliminated, and the capital funding is going to be reduced and eliminated. And that, in my opinion, has been a lot of the why so much of our infrastructure has started to fail. It's no different than highway infrastructure, though, or bridge infrastructure or dams. I mean, if you look at the ratings out there, all of our infrastructure across the entire country is failing because the funding has never been put in to actually maintain the buildings or the structures or whatever infrastructure thing it is, to actually then maintain it after it was built. So that's just been a big failure across the board. And then as far as a change that needs to happen is that if funding comes, or when it comes and however it comes, it needs to come with a source to provide the preventative maintenance in the future as well. It can't just be that then it's a pot that you have to take everything from, because the academics are always going to be taking first. It's got to be something that's dedicated for being able to maintain the buildings that then we replace with, or renovate with, or however it needs to be, because we've got buildings that are supposed to last for 50 years that are 150 years old. So when you've got your 3 times the lifespan on a building, that's pretty, unique and pretty, it stresses the building a lot. So it puts a lot of stress on the building and being able to maintain the building and the system that has to maintain that. But then in addition to that, the needs of the communities and the needs of the students have changed. And so we have to change with that. So I think that some of the funding that needs to come to has to be able to support that, has to support the wholeness rooms going into schools, and has to support the community use spaces to go into schools, so that we can actually meet the communities and provide that equity and not just build a space that is just a space.
Thank you. I know that was a big question, so I really appreciate that answer. Since we've got Dr. Hutchings here, I want to ask a question. This is for ATPS. So it's really not that long ago that our country's education system was segregated. White and Black students attended separate schools, and only until 1954, when Brown versus Board ruled against the longstanding practice of separate but equal in American schools. And then schools across the country were directed to desegregate. So ACPS, like many other schools across the country, has a very unique story, which was famously featured in the film Remember the Titans. I was wondering if you could give us some insights into this history and how it's played a role in defining ACPS and moving forward.
We just recently took on the Identity Project in Alexandria, where we actually renamed Thomas Chambliss Williams High School, which is known by Remember the Titans. Denzel Washington played Coach Boone, who was my gym teacher when I was in high school. But the one thing that came out of the Identity Project is the simple fact that a lot of people in Alexandria did not know our history. When you watch the movie Remember the Titans, it makes it seem like we came together, kumbaya, everything was over. First and foremost, we have to keep in mind, Remember the Titans took place in 1971, right? So it wasn't like it was in the 50s or the 60s. So that's the first thing. The second component to that is some of the same challenges that we have in regards to racial divisiveness and academic disparities that were happening in the 70s are still happening in 2021 at our school. which is now Alexandria City High School, effective July 1st. It will no longer be Thomas Chambers Williams High School. And that is because Thomas Chambers Williams, to the point that you were making earlier about our history, was a staunch racist who believed Black and white children cannot learn under the same roof. And he said, you know, it would have to be over his dead body that happens, that anything within his power he would do to prevent it. And he did that for 30 years as the superintendent. So the more we share our history, our true history, and the fact that, you know, our Black families in Alexandria were refused even after the 1954, May 17, 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. It wasn't until 1959 that the Black families who wanted to integrate Alexandria City Public Schools finally got a chance to do it. It took, you know, literally 5 years after Brown v. Board of Education. And that wasn't just in Alexandria, but that was in many school divisions across this country, because Brown v. Board of Education Part 2 says with all deliberate speed, which means you can take your time to have it done. And unfortunately, ACPS, we took our time, but the time is now to stop the systemic racism that is happening.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to kind of pivot a little and ask some of the questions from the audience. This one's for Jason with PG County. So this is from Omar Calderon. He asks for, you know, some of the challenges that you've encountered after implementing this new program. Could you share a little bit about, you know, what are those challenges and what have you guys encountered?
I think that a couple, and I alluded to it earlier, it's a different process. It's an accelerated delivery approach. So one of the biggest challenges has been really incorporating community input into the design process while not slowing it down, number one. Number two has really been being out front and discussing what, and if you do a P3, have you ever heard about it, you spend more time saying what we are not than what we are. So this will be owned by Prince George's County Public Schools. There will still be the same community use that we have today. There will still be public use of all of the fields. There will still, you know, I got one question that are we required to teach about certain types of building and architecture because of the architect and what they designed? Is that part of the curriculum now? So it's really been focused on, no, the reason why we're doing this and the challenges that, you know, we faced is around the deficiency that we have in the assets that we have in the schools that we have. You know, if you saw the conditions of some of these schools that we're knocking down, Cyndi said it earlier, one of the schools we're knocking down was built in 1937. You know, and it's one of those where we put a lot of Band-Aids on things, and now we are very focused on moving ahead. But the biggest challenges have been really expressing the urgency outside of we need new schools, but why we need new schools and why we have to evolve and why we can't just slow down, because there are too many students that are seeing and believing that the quality of their building is how we feel about them. And that is not the case. And we want to change that as quickly as possible.
Thank you. So Cyndi, we've got one for you from Deeja Sharma. She'd like to know a little bit more about the wholeness and mindfulness rooms that are being incorporated at your district.
Sure. So we have those actually not even just in the new buildings, we're actually putting them in almost every building across the district, which means finding a space, especially in the overutilized buildings, that, you know, becomes a challenge, but we're finding and carving out the spaces. But they're really, each school has kind of its different vision of it. And we actually have a whole department that's focused on them. It's about 4 people in that department, but it's about, you know, we're putting in, you know, carpets, rugs, not carpet, but rugs in the spaces to create softer spaces, furniture that is, you know, bean bags going into them, some of those rocker chairs, installing softer lighting. A lot of them have like the little bubble, I don't know all the technical names for them. I've seen them in so many of the spaces, but like the little bubble things that calm people down with the water. different colored lighting fixtures. We literally have one school that's actually brought in massage therapists for certain days of the week that they've gotten volunteered to provide services. So it really just depends on the school and what kind of supports they've gotten. But the generic, the general thing is something it's a calming space. It's a quiet space. It's not intended to have a lot of people in it at one time. And there is usually a wholeness coordinator or another coordinator that actually kind of monitors the space to make sure that nothing is really being destroyed, and the student is actually using things appropriately or whatever in there as they need to take their time to calm, de-escalate, whatever that might need to be.
Okay, great, thank you. So another popular question that we've got in the Q&A is about indoor air quality, and what efforts have been made both from a building operations perspective and for existing infrastructure retrofitting some of the old buildings in order to improve students' physical health. I was wondering, Erica, if you could start and respond from ACPS's perspective.
Sure. I think since I'm kind of responsible for new construction, it's probably best for Dr. Hart to respond, because I know we've done a lot on indoor air quality, if that's okay.
Great. Yep.
Sure thing. So yes, IAQ, or indoor air quality, has been a major topic, especially since the onset of COVID. So some of the things that we employed from the operational side was, first and foremost, we made sure that we continued on with our preventative maintenance activities on all of our HVAC systems. We also upgraded our filtration to MERV 13 filters in all of our HVAC systems. We installed UV technology at one of our one of our elementary schools where we already had an ongoing HVAC replacement project. So we were able to add this as a design element as part of that replacement project. And we're using that as actually a prototype and a pilot to determine whether or not we want to include UV technology in our new school designs. Most recently, we just employed HEPA-filtered air purifiers in all of our classroom spaces and other spaces throughout the building, as well as an additional measure when we moved from 6 feet of social distancing to 3 feet of social distancing within our facilities. We are continuing to look for ways to make sure that we continue to address our HVAC systems through, CARES Act funding, through our CIP process, and as Erica alluded to, through our new design process for all of our schools. So then that way we have a level of confidence of being prepared. God forbid if we're ever in a situation where we have another pandemic that is really exacerbated by air quality in our facilities.
Thank you. So the next question that we've got from the audience, this is from Diane. I'm going to direct this to Jason. I think this one would be good for you. So, since public schools are funded primarily by their localities and have partnerships or relationships with their local government counterparts, in what ways has your respective locality, city or county, been supportive or helpful in your equity efforts?
Very much so. I think that this has been a group effort. We have an MOU in place where 50% of the availability payment is above the county contribution for education to show their commitment. Additionally, we have been approved for another tranche of schools to do this again within the next 3 years. And they are, our local and state representatives are on board as well. They recognize that, the need for the facilities, but then they also recognize like the recruitment that a new school brings, and just the energy that a new school and environment brings, and to the community at whole. And so we've had incredible lockstep agreement. That was one of my concerns when I took this job, was that did everybody love it today? And then as soon as I showed up, that would everybody still love it? And for the most part, yes, it's been one of the best things about this is it's the simpatico that exists from the county and the school side, which is not always the case, but it definitely is in this case.
Thank you. All right, so the next question that I've got, I was thinking I direct this to Dr. Hutchings. This is from Rachel Pampel. And the question is about holistic equity efforts. I think it can be really overwhelming for folks to think about how do we solve all of the inequities in, maybe with one project. And most of the audience that's here today, a lot of them are architects. So typically they come on for a project, they're not involved necessarily in between projects. So we've got this kind of zoomed in lens. But if we take a step back and think about a holistic effort, how do we handle this kind of stress and this overwhelming feeling that we all have right now?
I think, well, the first thing you got to do is have self-care, right? And I say that, honestly, because I think that if you don't take care of yourself, it's difficult for you to take care of anybody else. I mean, that's first and foremost. Another piece is really working together. And, this is a collaborative effort, and it really does require things that are beyond your area of expertise. It requires literally an all hands on deck approach. When we talk about equity, I mean, you're going to have support from, when I'm speaking of Alexandria City Public Schools, from the city, from our community, from our families, from our students, from our board, from our staff. I mean, it literally is touching on so many different aspects and constituency groups that we're required to make sure we're building capacity with them and educating everyone so that they understand that this is a crisis. This is something that is going to require everything that you have to tackle. That's why it hasn't been done. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having this discussion about equity right now. This is probably one of the hardest things I know I've done as a superintendent. The first thing is COVID, dealing with this global pandemic first. That's probably the hardest thing I dealt with. But this is up at the top, in the top 3 in regards to trying to tackle equity. And it takes all of you. And if you are a person of color, meaning Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, it is an additional burden that you have because you can't turn this off. I talk to some of my white colleagues all the time who say, hey, Greg, just let this go and just take a break from it and, get back to it. Well, I can't change my color, no matter what. I'm a Black man in America. So I can't just say I'm going to stop today and then I'm going to take this back on tomorrow or when I feel like it or when I get my energy back, right? So I am constantly in influx, trying to figure out how to move forward with the additional burden of being a person of color. Really, a Black man in America is, as specific as I can be. So I don't know if that, answered your question in a long-winded way, but those are the multiple aspects and complications that this will require. But it's possible. So don't be discouraged by what I just said. It is still possible to get this done.
Well, on that note, we are getting close to time. So unfortunately, I think that's the last question we could answer today. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Luker. He is chair currently of the AIA DC chapter of the Committee on Architecture for Education. And Jeff, thank you. If you could unmute, go ahead. You're muted, Jeff. There you go.
Silence was probably the right response after that wonderful set of presentations. And I just want to say thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you to Janine and Lauren, who really took this by the bull of the horns and really pulled these participants together. And it's really been special. I feel like Dr. Hutchings, you really helped us really delve into the idea of systemic racism and the fact that schools is really a central place to address this concern. And you do it in a way that makes me feel hope. And then when I look around the room and I see Dr. Hart and Cyndi and Erica and Jason, and I realize that I really it's real. Diversity is strength. There is so much brilliance in the panel right here that it's really inspiring. And so I'm really pleased to see this kind of energy. You all have given us a lot of hope. And I think it'll add to our courage. And as we turn ourselves face forward from COVID, I hope that we can keep this energy here, and the smarts, the business smarts that Jason brought forth, Cyndi, the depth of the challenge, the deficiencies that you're addressing in Baltimore City are amazing, and thank you all. So just want to say thanks.
Thank you so much, everybody. So with that, I think we're done.
We are done. And I do want to do a self-supporting promotion. Janine, you're about to lead a follow-on presentation. Can you tell us what that is and when it is?
Sure. So you are all welcome to join us. We've got a panel discussion coming up, presentation, sorry, on June 15. This is going to be focused on the topic of Native American school design. The speaker will be from MOA Architecture in Denver, and he's going to present on the work that they're doing for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So that's going to be June 15 from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can go to our website, aianova.org, to register.
And then the coalition group here, Janine, Lauren, and myself are putting together a presentation in September where the members of our respective committees on architecture for education will present their work in a Picha-Kucha format. It'll be on September 15th, and it'll be a hybrid presentation both at the District Architectural Center and online.